On a peaceful autumn morning at Lake Mitchell, the mist hung low over the water as a solitary figure sat quietly on the weathered dock. His fishing rod barely moved as he watched the subtle ripples on the lake's surface. The man, in his early 30s, wore a simple gray hoodie and worn jeans, his presence almost melting into the serene landscape. Few would guess that just 3 weeks ago, he had been leading critical missions in some of the world's most dangerous regions as a Navy SEAL. He had chosen this spot deliberately, seeking the tranquility that had eluded him since his return. The steady rhythm of casting and reeling helped quiet the memories that still echoed in his mind. The lake had been his sanctuary since childhood, long before he'd enlisted, and now it served as his bridge back to civilian life. The morning silence was suddenly broken by the rumble of approaching motorcycles. A group of 5 bikers pulled into the lakeside parking area, their loud engines shattering the peaceful atmosphere. They were weekend warriors, dressed in leather vests and bandanas, the kind who tried hard to look tough but had never faced real danger. As they walked past the quiet fisherman, one of them snickered, pointing at his simple fishing setup. "Hey, look at this guy. Probably been sitting here all morning and hasn't caught anything bigger than a minnow," he called out, loud enough for his friends to hear. The others joined in with their own remarks, their voices carrying across the water. The fisherman remained still, his eyes fixed on the water. His calm exterior masked years of intensive training and combat experience. He had learned long ago that true strength lay not in responding to every provocation, but in knowing when to act and when to stay silent. The bikers, encouraged by his apparent passivity, continued their taunting. They started throwing small rocks into the water near his fishing line, trying to scare away any fish. "Come on, man, you're taking up the best spot. Why don't you pack up your kiddie gear and leave it to the real men?" What they couldn't see were the subtle changes in the fisherman's posture, the slight squaring of his shoulders, the controlled breathing techniques he'd mastered during BUD/S training. His hands remained steady on the fishing rod, but his senses had heightened, mapping the positions of each biker through their voices and movements. A particular splash caught his attention, not from the biker's rocks, but from something else. His line had gone taut. While the bikers continued their harassment, he began to reel in what he knew was a significant catch. The rod bent dramatically, and the line cut through the water in a wide arc. The bikers fell silent as they watched him skillfully play the fish. His movements were precise and efficient, betraying years of discipline and control. After a few minutes of careful maneuvering, he pulled in a massive largemouth bass, easily 7 pounds, the kind of fish that would make any angler proud. Standing up for the first time, his full frame became visible. Though not exceptionally large, his presence suddenly commanded attention. The morning light revealed scars on his forearms and the unmistakable trident tattoo partially visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve, the mark of a Navy SEAL. One of the younger bikers recognized the symbol immediately, his face draining of color. He grabbed his friend's arm, whispering something that made the whole group take a step back. The atmosphere shifted palpably as realization spread through their group. The fisherman unhooked his catch with practiced care and, to everyone's surprise, held it out toward the bikers. "Anyone want to take a picture?" he asked calmly, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from experiencing things far beyond their understanding. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the dock. The contrast between their earlier bravado and current discomfort was stark. One of the bikers, the oldest of the group, stepped forward with genuine remorse in his expression. "Sir, we didn't know," he stammered, unable to meet the fisherman's steady gaze. "My son serves in the Marines. I should have known better than to judge someone by their appearance." The fisherman nodded, acknowledging the apology without words. He carefully released the base back into the lake, watching it disappear into the depths. The moment served as a powerful reminder that true strength often lies beneath the surface, much like the mighty fish that swim in the quiet waters. As the bikers retreated to their motorcycles, their earlier bravado replaced by respectful silence, the fisherman returned to his peaceful vigil. The morning mist had begun to lift, revealing a lake that seemed somehow clearer, more vibrant than before. The incident would become a story told and retold around Lake Mitchell, not for its confrontation, but for its lesson about judgment, respect, and the quiet strength that some people carry within them. The fisherman would return to his spot many more times, finding in the lake's waters the peace he had fought so hard to protect. Word of the incident at Lake Mitchell spread through the small lakeside community like ripples on still water. The local diner buzzed with conversations about the humble Navy SEAL who had handled the situation with such grace. But for the quiet fisherman, life continued in its simple rhythm, each cast of his line bringing him closer to the peace he sought. The following weekend, he arrived at his usual spot to find something unexpected, a handwritten note tucked into the wooden planks of the dock. The paper was weathered, as if someone had struggled with whether to leave it. Opening it carefully, he read the message from one of the bikers from the previous weekend. The letter spoke of a nephew serving overseas, of sleepless nights waiting for news, and of a newfound understanding of what service really meant. The biker explained how their encounter had changed his perspective, not just about veterans, but about making assumptions about anyone. He ended with an invitation to join their weekly breakfast gathering at the lakeside diner. The fisherman folded the note carefully and slipped it into his tackle box. As he prepared his fishing gear, he reflected on his own journey of returning home. The hardest part hadn't been the transition from combat to civilian life, it had been learning to trust that civilians could understand and accept him, even without knowing his full story. Later that morning, the lake's surface erupted as something massive struck at his line. This wasn't like any fish he'd caught before, the power behind the pull was extraordinary. Drawing on his training, he remained calm, adjusting his stance on the dock for better leverage. The battle between man and fish became a meditation, each movement calculated and precise. A small crowd gathered as news of the epic struggle spread. Among the onlookers were two of the bikers from the previous weekend, their usual bravado replaced by genuine respect as they watched the fisherman work. For 45 minutes, he played the fish with patience and skill, never once showing frustration or anxiety. When he finally brought the fish alongside the dock, gasps rippled through the crowd. It was a catfish of legendary proportions, the kind that spawned local fishing tales. But what happened next surprised everyone even more. The fisherman carefully removed the hook and, with help from one of the bikers, took measurements and a quick photo before releasing the massive creature back into the lake. "Why'd you let it go?" asked a young boy who had been watching with wide-eyed wonder. "That could have been a record." The fisherman smiled, the first real smile many had seen from him. "Sometimes the greatest victory is in letting go," he replied, his words carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. "That fish has probably been in this lake longer than I've been alive. It deserves its freedom." The moment resonated with everyone present, especially the bikers who had witnessed both encounters. They recognized in his words the same principle that guided his response to their harassment: strength wasn't about domination, but about understanding when to exercise power and when to show mercy. As the crowd dispersed, one of the bikers approached him with an unusual request. The local veteran support group had been struggling to connect with younger veterans returning from recent conflicts. Would he consider sharing his story? Not the classified details of his missions, but his journey of finding peace at the lake? The fisherman listened quietly, his eyes scanning the water's surface. The request stirred something in him, a recognition that perhaps his own healing could help others find their way back. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "I'm not much for public speaking," he said, "but maybe we could do it here, by the water." Over the next few weeks, the dock became more than just a fishing spot. Veterans began showing up, some to fish, others just to sit quietly beside someone who understood. The bikers, many of whom were veterans themselves from earlier eras, became regular visitors. They brought coffee in the mornings, shared stories, and most importantly, created a space where silence was as welcome as conversation. The transformation was subtle but profound. The lake that had once been his solitary refuge became a place of community healing. Young veterans learned to fish alongside older ones, the repetitive actions of casting and reeling providing a rhythm to their conversations about adjustment and recovery. The fisherman's tackle box gradually accumulated more notes, not just from veterans, but from their families seeking advice on supporting their loved ones. He answered each one the same way he approached fishing, with patience, wisdom, and the understanding that every situation required its own unique approach. One morning, as fog rolled across the lake, he arrived to find the dock had been repaired and expanded. The bikers, working with local veterans groups, had quietly organized the renovation. They'd added benches and a small shelter, transforming it into a proper meeting spot while maintaining its peaceful character. "Hope you don't mind the changes," said the older biker who had apologized that first day. "Figured if this is going to be a healing spot, it should be built to last." The fisherman ran his hand along the smooth new railing, noting how they'd matched the weathered color of the original dock. In this simple act of community, he found another piece of the peace he'd been seeking. His quiet example had created ripples that were now coming back to him as waves of support and understanding. Standing there in the early morning light, he realized that sometimes the greatest battles we face aren't won with strength or skill, but with the courage to let others in, to share our burdens, and to help others carry theirs. The lake had become more than his personal sanctuary, it had become a testament to the healing power of community, understanding, and respect. As autumn deepened into winter, the lake's transformation continued in unexpected ways. The morning gatherings at the dock had caught the attention of a local newspaper reporter who frequently stopped by the diner for coffee. What intrigued her wasn't just the unlikely friendship between the bikers and the quiet fisherman, but the growing number of veterans who found their way to the lake's shores. One particularly cold morning, she arrived to find the fisherman teaching a young veteran how to tie fishing knots. The young man's hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the invisible wounds of war that many veterans carried. With infinite patience, the fisherman guided him through each movement, the repetitive actions providing a focus that seemed to steady both his hands and his mind. "It's like handling det cord," the fisherman said quietly, using a reference he knew the young veteran would understand. "Precision matters, but it's the calm focus that makes the difference." The young man's face lit up with understanding, and for a moment, the weight he carried seemed to lift. The reporter observed from a distance, knowing better than to interrupt. She'd learned from the diner's regulars about the unspoken rules of the dock: no pressing for war stories, no photographs without permission, and most importantly, respect for the healing that happened in the quiet moments between fish stories and coffee sips. That morning scene was just one of many small miracles that had become routine at the lake. The bikers, once seen as troublemakers by the local community, had become unofficial guardians of the dock. They kept the area clean, made sure there was always fresh coffee in the shelter, and most importantly, screened visitors to protect the sanctuary-like atmosphere that had developed. The fisherman's influence extended beyond the veterans' community. Local high school teachers began bringing troubled students to the dock after school. There was something about watching him fish, about the peace he emanated, that seemed to reach even the most resistant kids. He never lectured them; instead, he taught them to fish, letting the lessons of patience and persistence speak for themselves. One day, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot, and a man in a crisp military uniform stepped out. The fisherman recognized him immediately, his former commanding officer. They hadn't seen each other since the fisherman's last deployment, and the surprise visit brought a flood of memories. The commanding officer had heard about what was happening at Lake Mitchell. "You've created something special here," he said, scanning the improved dock and the small but steady stream of veterans who found their way there. "Something we couldn't provide with all our official programs and resources." The fisherman shrugged, characteristically modest. "The lake did most of the work," he replied, but they both knew it was more than that. He had found a way to bridge the gap between military and civilian life, not through formal therapy or programs, but through the simple act of fishing and the community that had grown around it. That afternoon, they were joined by several of the regular visitors, the bikers, some local veterans, and even a few townspeople who had become part of the lake's extended family. The commanding officer watched as his former SEAL, once one of his most capable operators, now worked his quiet magic in a different way. A young woman approached the group, introducing herself as the sister of a Marine serving overseas. She had been struggling with anxiety about her brother's deployment and had heard about the lake from another military family. Without hesitation, the regulars made space for her at the dock, offering coffee and quiet companionship. The fisherman handed her a spare rod, showing her the basics of casting. Fishing, he explained, is a lot like waiting for news from overseas. You can't control when it comes, but you can control how you handle the waiting. His words, simple but profound, brought tears to her eyes and understanding nods from the others present. The commanding officer stayed until sunset, witnessing the subtle ways the fisherman had adapted his military training to serve a different kind of mission. The leadership skills that had made him an effective SEAL now showed in how he guided people through their personal battles. The situational awareness that had kept his team alive in combat now helped him notice when someone needed extra support or simply some space to breathe. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the water, the commanding officer pulled the fisherman aside. The Navy's starting a new program, he explained, focusing on alternative approaches to veteran rehabilitation. They're looking for success stories, models they can learn from. The fisherman listened quietly, already knowing where this was heading. The commanding officer continued, they want to study what's happening here, maybe replicate it elsewhere. What do you think? After a long moment, the fisherman replied, what works here isn't something you can put in a manual. It's about giving people space to find their own way back, just like this lake did for me. The commanding officer nodded, understanding. This wasn't a program to be replicated, it was a reminder that healing often happens in the spaces between official interventions, in the quiet moments of connection and understanding. As if to emphasize the point, a splash broke the evening stillness. One of the regular veterans had hooked a fish, and everyone gathered to watch. The excitement wasn't about the size of the catch, it was about sharing in someone else's moment of joy, about being part of something larger than individual struggles. The commanding officer left that evening with a deeper appreciation for what his former SEAL had created. It wasn't just a fishing spot or a veterans gathering place, it was a bridge between worlds, a space where the rigid lines between military and civilian life blurred and dissolved in the ripples of Lake Mitchell's waters. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, the fisherman sat alone on the dock. The lake's surface was like glass, reflecting the first stars of the evening. He thought about how far things had come from that first confrontation with the bikers, how a moment of potential conflict had transformed into something healing and meaningful. A fish jumped somewhere in the darkness, the sound echoing across the water. In that moment, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that sometimes the greatest missions aren't the ones we're assigned, but the ones we discover along the way. Winter's grip on Lake Mitchell began to loosen as the first hints of spring emerged. The morning frost on the dock became lighter, and the dawn chorus of birds grew more vibrant with each passing day. The fisherman noticed these changes with the keen awareness that had kept him alive in combat zones, nature's subtle shifts that most people overlooked. One morning, he arrived to find an unfamiliar truck in the parking lot. A middle-aged man stood at the edge of the dock, his posture rigid with military bearing despite his civilian clothes. As the fisherman approached, he could see the man clutching a folded flag in his hands, the kind presented at military funerals. The man turned, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. "They said I might find you here," he said quietly. "My son." His voice caught, but he didn't need to finish. The fisherman understood immediately. Another casualty, another family bearing the weight of sacrifice. Without a word, the fisherman began setting up his fishing gear, preparing 2 rods instead of his usual one. The grieving father watched in silence as the fisherman methodically checked each line, tied each hook with practiced precision. Finally, he held out one of the rods. "Your son," the fisherman said softly, "would he have enjoyed fishing?" The father's hands trembled as he took the offered rod. "He loved it. We used to go every summer when he was young. Before." He trailed off, looking out over the water. They fished together as the sun climbed higher, sharing the quiet companionship that had become the dock's trademark. The father gradually began to speak, sharing stories of his son's childhood, his decision to enlist, his last deployment. The fisherman listened, offering no platitudes or empty comfort, just the steady presence of someone who understood the true cost of service. Around mid-morning, the regular crowd began to arrive. The bikers, now familiar with the unspoken language of grief that sometimes visited their sanctuary, kept a respectful distance. One of them quietly placed 2 cups of coffee near the fishing gear and retreated. As the day wore on, other veterans who frequented the dock began sharing their own stories of loss and remembrance. The father found himself surrounded by people who didn't try to diminish his grief or hurry him through it, but instead helped him carry it. The fisherman watched as the community he had inadvertently created worked its gentle magic. This was what he had learned in his years of service, that sometimes the strongest team wasn't the one that fought together, but the one that healed together. Late in the afternoon, the father's line suddenly went taut. The fisherman could tell by the bend in the rod that this was a significant catch. He guided the father through the fight, offering quiet suggestions as the fish tested both the line and the fisherman's skill. When they finally brought the fish alongside the dock, it was a magnificent bass, easily the largest caught this season. The father's hands had stopped trembling, his focus completely absorbed in the moment. As they carefully removed the hook, the fisherman saw something shift in the man's eyes, not an end to his grief, but perhaps the first tiny spark of learning to live with it. "Would you like to keep it?" the fisherman asked, though he already knew the answer. The father shook his head. "No," he said, watching as they released the bass back into the lake. "Some things you have to let go, even when you want to hold on forever." They both knew he wasn't just talking about the fish. That evening, as the light began to fade, the father carefully placed the folded flag on one of the dock's benches. "I think," he said slowly, "this belongs here. My son would have found peace in this place." The fisherman nodded, understanding the profound trust being placed in their community. The flag would join other memories and mementos that had found their way to the dock, each one a testament to the healing that happened there. As news of the flag spread through the veteran community, something remarkable began to happen. Other families started visiting the dock, bringing their own stories of loss and service. The small shelter gradually transformed into a living memorial, not one of marble and speeches, but of fishing tales and quiet understanding. The bikers, moved by the growing significance of their sanctuary, organized a dawn patrol. Every morning, before the first fisherman arrived, they would check the dock, straighten the memorial items, and ensure that this sacred space was maintained with the respect it deserved. One of the younger veterans, inspired by the father's visit, began organizing fishing trips for Gold Star families, those who had lost loved ones in service. The fishermen helped train volunteers on how to create the same peaceful atmosphere that had become the dock's hallmark. The local tackle shop, noting the dock's new role, started a program providing free fishing gear to military families. The owner, a Vietnam veteran himself, understood that sometimes the simple act of learning to fish could open doors that grief had sealed shut. The reporter who had been following the dock story wrote a follow-up piece, not about the programs or the memorial, but about the invisible threads of healing that connected everyone who visited. She described how the quiet fisherman had created something that traditional therapy couldn't replicate, a space where grief could coexist with hope, where silence spoke louder than words. Spring continued to advance, bringing with it new growth and change. The fisherman watched as the community he had unknowingly sparked continued to evolve and adapt. Each person who found their way to the dock added something unique to its character, a story, a memory, a moment of connection. The father became a regular visitor, sometimes fishing, sometimes just sitting quietly with his thoughts. On occasion, he would help newcomers learn to cast, sharing not just fishing techniques but the deeper lessons he had learned about loss and recovery. One morning, as mist rose from the lake's surface, the fisherman arrived to find a small brass plaque had been added to the shelter. It bore no names or dates, just a simple inscription: for those who served, those who waited, and those who never returned. Peace finds us here. Looking at the plaque, the fisherman reflected on how far things had come from that first confrontation with the bikers. What had started as his personal journey of healing had grown into something far more significant, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of shared understanding. As spring blossomed fully around Lake Mitchell, the dock's reputation spread beyond the local community. Veterans from neighboring states began making pilgrimages to this unlikely sanctuary, each bringing their own stories and struggles. The quiet fisherman watched as his simple act of finding peace had grown into something far larger than himself. One rainy Tuesday morning, a school bus pulled into the parking lot. The fisherman observed from his usual spot as a group of teenagers filed out, led by their history teacher. These weren't the troubled youth who occasionally visited the dock. They were AP history students working on a project about the impact of military service on local communities. The teacher had heard about the lake's transformation and arranged for his students to experience it firsthand. The bikers, now skilled at managing visitors, helped organize the group around the shelter. The students sat quietly, some taking notes, others simply absorbing the atmosphere that made this place special. The fisherman continued fishing, but he listened as various regulars shared their stories. A former helicopter pilot described how she found solace in the rhythmic casting of fishing lines, similar to the blade rotation of her aircraft. An older veteran spoke about how the lake helped him finally talk about his experiences in conflicts decades past. One student raised her hand, asking a question that cut to the heart of what made the dock unique: but why fishing? Why not something else? The fisherman reeled in his lines slowly, considering the question. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of experience. When you're fishing, you learn to read what's beneath the surface. You learn patience. You learn that some days, no matter what you do, the fish won't bite. But you come back anyway, because it's not just about catching fish. The students scribbled furiously in their notebooks, but one boy in the back wasn't writing. He sat perfectly still, tears running down his face. Later, he approached the fisherman privately and shared that his older brother was currently deployed overseas. The constant worry had been eating at him, but somehow, the fisherman's words about patience and persistence had given him a new way to think about the waiting. That afternoon, after the students left, a different kind of visitor arrived. A young woman in business attire approached the dock, clearly out of her element in high heels. She introduced herself as a representative from a national veterans organization, interested in replicating the dock's success elsewhere. "We have funding," she explained enthusiastically. "We could build similar facilities across the country. Create programs, schedules, structured activities." The fisherman listened politely, but the regular visitors exchanged knowing glances. They understood what the woman didn't, that the magic of Lake Mitchell couldn't be franchised or programmed. It had grown organically, built on trust, respect, and the simple act of sharing space with others who understood. The bikers, showing unexpected diplomatic skills, helped explain this to the representative. "You can't schedule healing," one of them said, gesturing to the lake. "Sometimes it takes sitting here for weeks before someone's ready to talk. Sometimes they never talk, and that's okay too." The woman stayed for several hours, watching the natural ebb and flow of visitors to the dock. She saw how people arrived carrying the weight of their experiences and gradually found their own ways to set that weight down, even if just for a moment. By the time she left, her notebook was empty, but her understanding was fuller. As summer approached, the fisherman noticed another change in the dock's dynamic. Family members of active service members began visiting more frequently, forming their own informal support network. They shared news from different deployment zones, celebrated letters received, and supported each other through the difficult days of waiting. One morning, the fishermen arrived to find a group of children at the dock with their mothers. These were military kids, dealing with the absence of deployed parents. The regular visitors, including the bikers, showed remarkable gentleness with these young visitors, teaching them to fish and sharing stories that helped them feel connected to their absent parents. A 7-year-old girl, after successfully catching her first fish, looked up at the fisherman with serious eyes. "My daddy's a soldier," she declared. "He's been gone for 158 days. Did you ever have to be gone from your family?" The fisherman knelt down to her level, his usual reserve softening. "I did," he replied. "And you know what helped me? Knowing that brave kids like you were waiting for me to come home." The girl's mother wiped away tears as her daughter beamed with pride. This simple exchange captured what made the dock special, its ability to heal not just veterans, but the entire military family. The lake's influence continued to ripple outward. Local businesses began offering support in their own ways. The hardware store donated materials for dock maintenance, the grocery store provided coffee and snacks, and the local restaurant started delivering hot meals during bad weather. One day, a box arrived at the dock containing hand-tied fishing flies from a master tier 3 states away. The accompanying note explained that the tier, a Vietnam veteran, had heard about Lake Mitchell and wanted to contribute to its healing mission in his own way. The fisherman added these flies to the community tackle box that had become a symbol of the dock's sharing economy. Veterans would bring what they could, lures, lines, knowledge, stories, and take what they needed. Some days, what they needed wasn't fishing gear at all, but rather the understanding that came from being among others who had walked similar paths. The dock story began appearing in military family support groups and veteran forums online. But unlike many viral stories, this one maintained its integrity. Those who made the journey to Lake Mitchell found exactly what they'd heard about, not a miracle cure or a structured program, but a place where healing happened in its own time and way. As the fisherman sat on the dock one evening, watching the sun set over the lake, he reflected on how this place had evolved. What started as his personal refuge had become a sanctuary for hundreds. The lake had taught him, and now taught others, that healing wasn't about forgetting or getting over it. It was about finding a way to carry their experiences while still moving forward. A great blue heron landed silently on a nearby piling, its presence adding to the peaceful scene. The bird's patient stillness as it watched the water reminded him of the lessons the lake had taught, that sometimes the most powerful acts are the quietest ones, that healing often comes not from doing more, but from learning to be still. The next morning, as he walked down to his usual spot, he noticed something new. Someone had carved a simple message into one of the dock's new boards: "Peace isn't a place, it's a practice." He smiled, recognizing the truth in those words. Lake Mitchell hadn't given him peace, it had taught him how to find it within himself, a lesson he had unknowingly passed on to others. Summer brought longer days and new challenges to Lake Mitchell. The increasing number of visitors threatened to disturb the delicate balance that made the dock special. The fisherman watched carefully, concerned that the sanctuary's growing popularity might compromise its healing atmosphere. One particularly busy morning, a television crew arrived unannounced, eager to capture what they called the miracle at the lake. The reporter, dressed for a broadcast rather than a fishing dock, approached with a microphone and camera operator in tow. Before they could reach the dock, the bikers intercepted them with quiet but firm resolve. "This isn't a story for television," the eldest biker explained, his voice gentle but leaving no room for argument. "What happens here is personal. Private. Sacred." The crew persisted, offering to be unobtrusive, to tell the dock story to a wider audience. But the regulars stood firm, forming a protective barrier around their sanctuary. The fisherman observed this interaction from his usual spot, proud of how the community protected itself. They understood that the dock's power lay partly in its privacy, in being a place where veterans could let their guard down without fear of exposure or exploitation. Later that day, a different kind of visitor arrived, a renowned psychologist specializing in PTSD treatment. Unlike the TV crew, she came alone and asked permission to simply observe. The regulars welcomed her, recognizing her genuine desire to understand rather than study. Throughout the day, she witnessed small moments that no camera could have captured: a veteran teaching his young daughter to tie fishing knots, his hands steady for the first time in months, two soldiers from different eras sharing a thermos of coffee in comfortable silence, a military widow finding solace in the presence of others who understood her loss. The psychologist sat with the fisherman as the sun began to set. "I've worked with veterans for 20 years, she said quietly, "but I've never seen anything quite like this. There's no clinical term for what you've created here." The fisherman cast his line into the darkening water. "That's because we didn't create it," he replied. "The lake did. We just learned to listen." That night, after most visitors had left, a summer storm rolled across the lake. Lightning illuminated the clouds, and thunder echoed across the water. The fishermen and a few regulars stayed, knowing that some veterans found these storms particularly challenging. Sure enough, a young veteran arrived, clearly struggling with the thunderous reminders of combat. Without a word, the group shifted to make space for him in the shelter. One of the bikers handed him a cup of coffee, while another began telling funny stories about fishing mishaps, providing a gentle distraction from the storm. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the storm having washed everything clean. The fishermen arrived to find a small group of volunteers repairing minor damage to the dock. Among them was a contractor who had never served but had been touched by the dock's mission. He worked quietly, refusing payment, saying only that some things were worth doing for their own sake. As summer progressed, the dock began hosting dawn fishing sessions for veterans struggling with sleep. The early morning hours, when mist hung over the water and the world was still quiet, proved especially therapeutic. The fishermen would arrive before sunrise, setting up extra rods for anyone who might come. One such morning, a former combat medic arrived, haunted by memories of those he couldn't save. He didn't speak, but the fisherman recognized the look in his eyes. They fished together as the sun rose, and gradually, the medic began to talk about a particularly difficult day in a distant desert. The fisherman listened, offering no judgments or solutions, just the steady presence of someone who understood. As they talked, a large fish took the medic's line. The ensuing battle with the fish demanded his complete focus, pulling him momentarily from his memories into the present moment. After successfully landing and releasing the fish, the medic noticed his hands had stopped shaking. "I've been to dozens of therapy sessions," he said, "but this is the first time I've felt grounded." The fisherman nodded, understanding that sometimes healing came not from confronting the past, but from finding anchors in the present. Word of the dawn session spread, and soon a small group of regulars formed. They called themselves the Dawn Patrol, though it had nothing to do with military operations. Instead, they found solidarity in sharing those quiet morning hours when the weight of their memories felt heaviest. The lake's healing influence began extending beyond veterans. First responders, having heard about the dock's power, started visiting. They found common ground with the veterans, sharing similar experiences of trauma and the challenge of processing difficult experiences while staying strong for others. One police officer, after several visits, summed it up perfectly: "Out here, we don't have to be the tough ones. We can just be human." His words resonated with many visitors who had struggled with the weight of others' expectations of strength. As summer reached its peak, the dock hosted its first official gathering, a sunset memorial service for a local veteran who had found peace at the lake in his final months. His family chose the dock over the traditional cemetery, understanding that this place had given him something no formal service could provide. The ceremony was simple but profound. The bikers organized a flag line, standing at attention as the family arrived. The fisherman broke from his usual silence to share how the veteran had touched their community. As the sun set, dozens of fishing lines cast into the golden water simultaneously, a 21-cast salute that perfectly captured the dock's spirit. That evening marked a subtle shift in the dock's identity. While it remained primarily a place of healing, it had also become a place of celebration, celebrating life, resilience, and the connections that helped people survive their darkest moments. The fisherman, watching the community's evolution, recognized that the dock had taken on a life of its own. What started as his personal journey had grown into something that belonged to everyone who found their way there. Each person who visited added their own thread to the tapestry of healing that was being woven beside the lake. Late one evening, as the fisherman prepared to leave, he found a young boy sitting alone at the end of the dock. The child explained that his father, a Marine, was deployed, and he came to the dock because it feels closer to him here. The fisherman sat with him for a while, teaching him to tie a new kind of knot, understanding that sometimes the simplest acts of kindness could bridge the greatest distances. As summer began to wane, Lake Mitchell's waters held a different kind of energy. The morning mist lingered longer, and the first hints of fall colors touched the surrounding trees. The fisherman noticed how the changing season brought new visitors to the dock, each carrying their own stories of service and sacrifice. One crisp morning, an elderly man arrived using a walker, accompanied by his middle-aged son. The son explained that his father, a Korean War veteran, had recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer. The old warrior had read about Lake Mitchell and insisted on making the journey while he still could. The fisherman helped position a chair for the elderly veteran, adjusting it so he could still cast his line into the water. As they fished together, the old man began sharing stories he'd kept silent for over 60 years. His son sat behind them, tears streaming down his face as he heard these tales for the first time. "I never could talk about it before," the elderly veteran explained, his weathered hands steady on the fishing rod. "But something about this place, it feels right to let these stories out here, where they can drift away on the water." The regulars at the dock, sensing the significance of the moment, created a protective circle around the family, their presence both supportive and unobtrusive. The bikers ensured fresh coffee was always available, while other veterans occasionally shared their own experiences, creating bridges across generations of service. That afternoon, the elderly veteran caught a beautiful bass. As they helped him release it back into the lake, he smiled. "Like letting go of old burdens," he said softly. His son squeezed his shoulder, understanding that they had gained something precious in this moment of sharing and release. The following week brought an unexpected visitor, a young tech entrepreneur whose brother had been killed in action. He arrived with an innovative idea, a mobile app that would help veterans find peaceful fishing spots like Lake Mitchell across the country. The regulars listened politely but exchanged knowing glances. "Technology's great," one of the bikers explained, "but what makes this place special can't be coded into an app. It's about the people, the presence, the patience." The entrepreneur stayed for several days, gradually understanding that the dock's magic lay not in its location or activities, but in the invisible bonds formed between those who gathered there. He left with a different kind of inspiration, promising to support the dock's natural growth rather than trying to replicate it digitally. As September approached, the dock faced a new challenge. The increasing number of visitors had begun to strain the lake's fishing population. The fishermen, ever mindful of maintaining balance, worked with local conservation officials to develop sustainable practices that would preserve both the lake's ecology and its healing mission. They implemented a strict catch-and-release policy and began teaching visitors about environmental stewardship. The lake, they explained, was not just a place of healing for people, but a living ecosystem that deserved respect and protection. This environmental consciousness added another layer to the dock's mission. Veterans found that learning about the lake's ecosystem provided yet another way to focus their minds and find purpose. Many began participating in conservation efforts, finding healing in protecting and nurturing the waters that had helped them. One morning, a group of Native American veterans visited the dock. They performed a traditional blessing ceremony, honoring the water's healing spirit and the community that had formed around it. The ceremony brought tears to many eyes, as it captured something essential about what the lake meant to all who found peace there. The blessing seemed to deepen the dock's purpose. Veterans who had struggled to reconcile their warrior spirit with their need for peace found wisdom in the Native American perspective of balance between strength and gentleness, between protecting and healing. As autumn's chill began to assert itself, the fishermen noticed more families visiting the dock together. Veterans who had initially come alone now brought their spouses, children, and even grandchildren. The dock became a place where military families could heal together, bridging the gaps that service often created. A military counselor who frequently referred veterans to the dock observed that families who fished together at Lake Mitchell showed remarkable improvements in communication and understanding. The simple act of sharing space and purpose by the water helped them rebuild connections strained by deployment and trauma. The dock's shelter, once a simple refuge from rain, had evolved into a living museum of military family life. Photos, letters, and mementos shared wall space with fishing gear. Each item told a story of service, sacrifice, and survival. New visitors often spent hours simply absorbing these testimonies of resilience. One rainy afternoon, a group of young veterans who had been regular visitors approached the fishermen with an idea. They wanted to start a mentoring program, passing on not just fishing skills but the deeper lessons they'd learned about healing and peace. The fishermen listened as they outlined their plan. It wasn't a formal program with schedules and requirements, but rather a natural extension of the dock's existing culture of support and understanding. He nodded his approval, recognizing that the next generation was ready to carry forward the dock's mission. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the lake, the fisherman watched a mentor working with a newcomer. The younger veteran's hands shook as he tried to tie a fishing knot, but the mentor showed infinite patience, sharing not just the technique but the calm focus that came with it. Lightning flickered in the distance, but neither man flinched. They had found in each other and in the lake a sanctuary stronger than their fears. The storm could rage, but here by the water, they had learned to face it together. As the fisherman prepared to leave that night, he found a note tucked into his tackle box. It was from the elderly Korean War veteran's son, sharing that his father had passed away peacefully, talking about the peace he'd found at Lake Mitchell in his final days. The next morning, the fishermen arrived before dawn to find several regulars already at the dock. Without a word, they understood why he had come early. Together, they cast their lines into the misty water as the sun rose, honoring another warrior who had found his way home through the healing waters of Lake Mitchell. The lake's surface glowed gold in the early light, and somewhere in the distance, a fish jumped, breaking the silence with a splash that sounded almost like a salute. The fisherman smiled, knowing that while they had lost another member of their unique family, his story, like so many others, had become part of the lake's endless flow of healing and hope. A year had passed since that first confrontation between the bikers and the quiet fishermen. Lake Mitchell's waters had witnessed countless stories of healing, forgiveness, and restoration. As winter approached once again, the fishermen reflected on how a simple act of restraint had sparked a movement of peace that touched hundreds of lives. One cold morning, the fishermen arrived to find an unexpected gathering at the dock. The original group of bikers stood waiting, along with dozens of veterans, family members, and locals whose lives had been changed by the lake's healing presence. The oldest biker stepped forward, his leather vest now adorned with patches representing various veteran support organizations. "We wanted to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we knew you wouldn't want any big ceremony. So we thought we'd just fish together, like always." The fisherman nodded, understanding that this simple gesture meant more than any formal recognition. As they set up their gear, a young soldier who had recently returned from deployment shared how news of Lake Mitchell had reached his unit overseas. "We'd heard stories about a place where veterans could find peace," he explained. "Some guys thought it was just a legend, but those of us who were struggling, it gave us hope to know this place was waiting. The morning unfolded like many others, yet held a special significance. Each person present represented a different chapter in the dock's ongoing story. The bikers, once perceived as troublemakers, had become guardians of this sacred space. Veterans who had arrived broken had found strength to help others. Families torn apart by service had rebuilt their bonds by the water. Around midday, the local diner owner arrived with hot food for everyone. As they shared the meal, stories flowed as freely as the coffee. A military spouse described how the dock had helped her children understand their father's post-deployment struggles. A retired general spoke about recommending Lake Mitchell to young officers struggling with command decisions. The fisherman listened, touched by how each person had found their own meaning in this place. The lake had become more than a healing space, it was a testament to the power of community, understanding, and the simple act of being present for others in pain. As afternoon approached, something remarkable happened. A bald eagle, rare for this area, circled overhead before landing on a nearby tree. The group fell silent, watching as the majestic bird surveyed the lake. For many, it felt like a sign, nature itself acknowledging the sacred work that happened here. The eldest biker's granddaughter, a 7-year-old who had become a dock regular, tugged at the fisherman's sleeve. "The eagle's like you," she whispered. "It watches over everyone but stays quiet." Her innocent observation brought gentle laughter from the group, acknowledging the truth in her words. Later that day, as the sun began to set, the fisherman noticed something had changed in how the regulars interacted with newcomers. The healing that had begun with his own journey had come full circle. Those who had found peace here were now guiding others toward it, each in their own way. A young Marine, recently returned from his first deployment, struggled with his fishing line. Before the fisherman could move to help, 3 different veterans approached, each offering assistance in the patient, undemanding way they had learned from watching him. The Marine's tense shoulders gradually relaxed as he found himself surrounded by understanding rather than judgment. As darkness fell, someone produced candles, placing them in mason jars along the dock's edge. The light reflected off the water, creating a gentle glow that seemed to embrace everyone present. In this soft light, the differences between bikers, veterans, families, and civilians faded away. They were simply people who had found healing by the water. The fisherman's former commanding officer, who had become an occasional visitor, spoke quietly about how Lake Mitchell had changed military mental health programs. "We've learned that sometimes the best healing happens in the spaces between official treatments," he admitted. "Sometimes it just takes a quiet place and people who understand." A local artist who had been documenting the dock story through sketches shared her latest work, a series of drawings capturing quiet moments of healing by the water. In one, a veteran taught a child to cast a line. In another, 2 soldiers from different eras shared coffee in silent understanding. Each image captured the essence of what made this place special. As the gathering began to disperse, the original bikers presented the fisherman with a handmade plaque. Unlike the official recognitions he had declined, this one spoke to the heart of their shared journey. It read simply, "Sometimes the strongest warriors are the quietest ones. Thank you for showing us another way to be brave." The fisherman accepted the plaque with a nod, then did something unexpected. He began to speak, his voice soft but carrying clearly across the water. "This place," he said, gesturing to the lake, "it was here long before us, and it'll be here long after. We just had to learn to listen to what it was teaching us." He continued, sharing for the first time how he had found his way to Lake Mitchell after his final deployment. How the water had helped him find his way back to himself. How watching the bikers approach that first day, he had seen not a threat, but an opportunity to break the cycle of confrontation. "Each of you," he said, looking around at the gathered faces, "brought something essential to this place. The healing that happens here isn't because of any one person. It's because we all learn to be still, to listen, to let the water teach us about peace." As if in response to his words, a fish jumped nearby, creating ripples that spread across the lake's surface. Everyone watched as the circles expanded, touching each other and creating new patterns, much like the ways their own stories had intersected and influenced each other. The gathering ended as it had begun, with the simple act of fishing. Lines cast into the darkening water, the quiet communion of people who had found in each other and in the lake something they hadn't known they were seeking. Later that night, after everyone had left, the fisherman remained at his usual spot. The lake was quiet now, but he could feel the echoes of all the healing that had happened here. The tears shed, the burdens released, the peace found. As he packed up his gear, he noticed a small group of wild geese landing on the water. Their arrival seemed to signal the changing of seasons, a reminder that life moved in cycles of challenge and peace, struggle and healing. The fisherman smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new visitors to the dock, new stories to be shared, new healing to begin. Lake Mitchell would continue its quiet work, offering peace to those who needed it, one cast at a time. The quiet fisherman walked back to his truck, leaving only footprints in the frost-covered dock. But his legacy would continue in the countless lives touched by the simple wisdom he had shared, that sometimes the greatest battles are won not through confrontation, but through the quiet courage to choose peace instead.